Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Buchanan, and the focus is off to Europe while Kansas bleeds. The year is 1849, and Buchanan's stint as Secretary of State has come to an end as the Polk administration had expired. The new Whigs were now in power. Buchanan's 58 years old. He's out of a job, but he's actually about to start the most relaxing and enjoyable 4 years, perhaps, of his entire life. Moving back to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he moved into his new home called Wheatland. It was about 1.5 miles from the city center, and it was a social gathering point as Buchanan lived the life of the country squire, brought all kinds of family and friends and good food and drink and cigars. This was a good time for Buchanan. He had Miss Hetty running his household and his niece Harriet, who he pretty much had adopted and been raising. She's now 19 years old and very much coming into her own. Buchanan had some advice for her, though. When you start thinking about having a match going forward, he said, "You ought never to marry any man to whom you are not attached. But you ought never to marry any person who is not able to afford you a decent and immediate support. In my experience, I have witnessed the long years of patient misery and dependence which fine women have endured from rushing precipitously into matrimonial connections without sufficient reflection." He was not only being protective of his niece, giving her this advice, and of course in the context of James Buchanan, the only president of the United States who never got married. Harriet was just one of his 22 nieces and nephews to go with 13 grandnieces and nephews, and many of them were very much down in their luck. Of his 10 siblings, most of them did not do well. He was the only one who really had any money, and he was pretty generous. He paid for their school in many cases. In fact, he welcomed many of them into his home at Wheatland, gave them a place to stay, especially during the summer months. It was a very robust, happening place. Well, politics, of course, continuing on in the country, and Buchanan had his eye on all of this. And a lot of the attention was what was going on in the territories recently acquired in the Mexican War on the specific topic of slavery expansion. Would slavery be permitted not only in Texas, but also in New Mexico, in California? Controversy between North and South, and it was getting pretty intense. There was also a move to build a grand compromise around this topic, not just on slavery in the territories, but also some of the other long-standing issues that have been bothering North and South on slavery for decades, in fact. The President of the United States, Zachary, was not in favor of this grand compromise. He thought it was unnecessary. Why are you opening up all these cans of worms? Focus just on the task at hand. Stay away from the compromise. He was threatening a veto. But Zachary died July of 1851, just a little over a year into his term. Millard Fillmore of New York, he becomes president of the United States. He favors the compromise. Just 10 weeks into his presidency, he signs them into law. As James Buchanan looked at all of this, he said 2 things are necessary to preserve this union from danger. Number 1, agitation in the North on the subject of Southern slavery must be rebuked and put down by a strong and enlightened public opinion. Number 2, the fugitive slave law must be enforced in its spirit. The fugitive slave law was a part of this compromise of 1850, and it put some responsibilities on people in the North, not just public officials, but even ordinary citizens could be punished if they were found to be helping runaway slaves. A lot of people in the North were upset about this. How dare you in the South start imposing your will on us to make us complicit in your act of slavery? A lot of agitation in the North, but none from James Buchanan. He thought this was a good thing because grand compromises would maybe get this whole issue away, because James Buchanan didn't really ever care much on the topic of slavery. One way or the other, he just wanted it settled. He wanted the issue gone, and if this could help create a compromise that would quiet the issue, perhaps forever, he was going to favor it. Besides, him being a constitutionalist, a strict constructionist, this idea of fugitive slave law was baked into the Constitution itself. As Buchanan wrote, it is well-known historical fact that without this provision, the Constitution itself could never have existed. How could this have been otherwise? Is it possible for a moment to believe that the slave states would have formed a union with the free states under it, their slaves, by simply escaping across the boundary which separates them, would acquire the rights of freemen? His answer to this was obviously no. He would support the fugitive slave law in his hope that it would actually create equities that North and South would all be satisfied with in this topic of a grand compromise. Well, now moving forward into the election of 1852, James Buchanan for the third time was going to be in the mix for President of the United States. He thought this might be finally his year. Lewis Cass, the nominee from 1848 from Michigan, also back in the race now. You've got Stephen Douglas, an up-and-coming senator for Illinois, is being considered. And with three strong candidates, once again for the Democrats, this was going to be tough. When they got together in convention, they had to get to a supermajority of 2/3. That was the mark for the Democrats to get a presidential nomination. Well, the first couple of days of balloting basically was going nowhere in terms of reaching that 2/3 threshold. Cass was out on front in the first 20 ballots with Buchanan behind him, and then they switched places for the next dozen ballots where Buchanan was on top, but nobody was getting close to that 2/3 threshold. So after 2 days, Buchanan's people had an idea. Let's go ahead and let some of the states introduce some of their favorite sons, some of these dark horse candidates, just to prove to the delegates that there's no way any of them are going to be able to get to the 2/3 threshold, and that will force them to come back to someone like himself. Well, this idea completely backfired because on the second ballot of that third day, New Hampshire's Franklin Pierce, former congressman, was one of these favorite sons who was mentioned, and he started getting some staying power in the balloting, along with William Marcy, the former governor of New York, also having some staying power. Well, the convention eventually turned to Pierce when the South viewed him as a northerner who had appropriate sympathies for the Southern interests, similar to Buchanan, by the way, but Pierce was the one who emerged in this category, and on the 49th ballot, he became the nominee. To Buchanan's credit, he didn't go off and sulk. He still supported his party. He went out and stumped for Pierce in Pennsylvania. Pearson goes on to win the presidency in an easy landslide in the fall election. So, would Buchanan have a role in a Democratic administration that's back in power? Well, Pierce said at the very beginning that he was not interested in having people who had been in previous cabinets in his cabinet. So he wasn't going to have a shot at a cabinet spot. But Pierce did want him in his administration in a diplomatic role. Buchanan had been Secretary of State. He had been a successful minister to Russia earlier in his career, and he wanted Buchanan at the top of his diplomatic corps, going off to Great Britain as the American ambassador. Well, Buchanan had to think about this because all of his decisions now were based on would it help him or hurt him to become president of the United States. That was his goal, and that was the context in which he took a look at this. He also went to Pierce with sort of a requirement in his mind. He wanted an agreement that all the relationship activities between Britain and the United States would flow through him, that people weren't going to try to go around him or undercut him, and Pierce agreed to this. Well, as soon as he did, and as soon as Buchanan accepted the position, he basically reneged, because there was a burning issue that was happening right at the beginning of Pierce's administration, even before Buchanan got underway, and it had to do with a dispute with Britain, between the United States and Canada, over the fisheries in the off the northeastern coast of the United States. And this was personal for Pierce. New Hampshire, pretty close by. He was very familiar with the New England fishermen and their opportunities and their challenges. He wanted this solved quickly, so he put Secretary of State Marcy in charge of it. Marcy did a good job, solved that problem, but Buchanan kind of felt that he had his legs cut out from under him before he even got started. Another reason why Buchanan might have been willing to take this position is that his longtime friend and housemate, William King, the former senator of Alabama who had recently been sworn in as Vice President of the United States, died just 1 month into that term. Perhaps a change of scenery would be a good thing for Buchanan as well. Well, the first challenge for Buchanan was what to wear. He had already been dealing with the outlandish costumes of the royal courts of Russia when he was a minister previously, and now, though, things were changing. Secretary William Marcy, now Secretary of State, put out a circular that told guidance for all foreign diplomats of the United States to only wear plain American clothes as appropriate in representing a republic like the United States, not a royal court. Well, Buchanan was intrigued by this, but he also had concerns. Would he even be received in the Royal Court of England if he showed up in these plain American attire? Well, he tried on a whole bunch of different things. Nothing was really satisfying him, and somebody suggested, look, wear your plain American clothes and put a sword on. Use that as sort of be the diplomatic element of your outfit and see if see if that will work as far as the Brits are concerned. So that's what he tried. And sure enough, he went, and when he first met Queen Victoria, she actually approached him in this very plain outfit with the sword, and she smiled, apparently giving her approval. And Buchanan noted that, "I must confess that I never felt more proud of being an American." Well, that was a good start. Now he had to deal with his diplomatic challenges, including a fallout from the recently signed Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. This was an agreement between Britain and the United States that would give the United States the ability to build a canal across Nicaragua in Central America to bring the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans together. Britain and the United States both had equities in this area. They had come to an agreement, but even before the ink was dry with the signatures, there was disagreement on the wording involved in this treaty. What did certain words mean, in particular the word occupy? Now, this again played into a thing that Buchanan had done throughout his whole career. As a lawyer and as a congressman, he would often parse words to use a legalistic sense of getting the meaning and winning his point. And in this case, he was arguing about whether or not the word occupy only meant future occupation or also covered past occupation. According to Buchanan, it is difficult to comment on language which appears so plain, or to offer arguments to prove that the meaning of words is not directly opposite to their well-known signification. Well, in this case, the Americans and Buchanan had a pretty strong argument about their definition of this word occupy, but the Brits weren't having it. They would bicker about it throughout this term, and in fact, for many, many years, eventually, of course, no canal would ever be built across Nicaragua. Then there was the issue of Cuba. Franklin Pierce was certainly not the first president of the United States who wanted to acquire Cuba. But as part of his vision, manifest destiny, acquire more land, expansionist perspective, not just across North America, but how about also in the Caribbean? And he thought Cuba, a long interest to the United States, might be a good target. And so he picked Pierre Soule to be his minister to Spain. And Soule was clearly always very much pro-annexation of Cuba. He was given permission to spend a bunch of money, go to Spain, which owned Cuba, see if you can buy it. Well, Spain wasn't terribly interested in this idea, but Pierce continued to push. And he said, you know what? I want my top 3 diplomats in Europe, Soule in Spain, John Mason in France, and James Buchanan in Great Britain, to come together, review the history of this situation, write a report, make some recommendations. What should I do? Well, the 3 of them did agree to get together. They met in Ostend, Belgium, to do this report on behalf of their president. Unfortunately, all of Europe seemed to know that this was happening and the Americans were up to something. And so a lot of the press from Europe showed up in Ostend, Belgium, and they basically couldn't get any work done. So after 3 days, the 3 of them left. They went to a small town in Germany to eventually produce this document that was called the Ostend Manifesto. Most of this was actually pretty misunderstood in terms of what people interpreted and the parts that they focused on. A lot of the document was a history and actually a pretty reasoned explanation on why the sale of Cuba to the United States was not only good for the United States, good for the Cuban people, but also good for Spain. That was a lot of the document. But most people then focused on this latter portion, where the 3 diplomats in their Ostend Manifesto, which is what the document was called, posed a question. In the question, they said, does Cuba, in the possession of Spain, seriously endanger our internal peace and the existence of our cherished union? This was a question. They continued. Should this question be answered in the affirmative, then by every law, human and divine, we shall be justified in wresting it from Spain if we possess the power. And this upon the very same principle that would justify an individual in tearing down the burning house of his neighbor if there were no other means of preventing the flames from destroying his own home. Important. We forbear to enter into the question whether the present condition of the island would justify such a measure. They raised the question, specifically said they didn't answer the question. But that is not how the Europeans saw this document. They saw this as American imperialism, a pure justification to go take this island, perhaps militarily from Spain, outrage in Europe. As for the people who really mattered most, President Pierce and Secretary of State William Marcy, they looked at this, they saw that question, and they answered no. They simply said at this point, while they wanted to buy Cuba, Cuba was not seriously endangering the internal peace of the United States. They essentially repudiated the Austin Manifesto. Cuba would stay with Spain. The best thing for James Buchanan during the Franklin Pierce presidency was that he was out of the country. He was out of sight, out of mind, which was great because things were not going well back in the United States. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had been passed, and this opened up the Kansas territory under the concept of popular sovereignty, where the locals in the territory would decide free or slave. Well, this created a mad dash into the Kansas territory from the other parts of the country. You ended up getting competing governments that were established in their own rights, both vying for position for authority. There was violence that was occurring. It was eventually called Bleeding Kansas because of this violence. Chaos was ensuing, and there were no politicians who could speak on this topic without offending someone. If you said one thing, the North was going to be upset. You said something else, the South was going to be upset. Didn't matter what you did, somebody was going to be upset, which is why it was good for James Buchanan not to be around. Again, out of sight, out of mind. He was pretty much untainted by this really difficult political environment going on with Bleeding Kansas. Nothing better for him as he was heading home just in time for the 1856 presidential election. But that's the story for another day. That's James Buchanan. Off to Europe while Kansas bleeds. From the life of James Buchanan. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.